start my sermon. I think I'm in a silly mood today. Okay, now we're going to get serious. This summer, I was in Israel, and I went to Mount Herzl, among plenty of other things that I did. Actually, I went twice to Mount Herzl, but the first time it turned out to be a place for me to turn around on my walk, and then I went back home. I went by myself to Mount Herzl, and I arrived after walking a few miles, which in general is not that much, but if you know Israel in the summer and add a heat wave, it was very, very hot. When I got there, I passed the buses full of IDF soldiers unloading and preparing for a tour. For sure they were going to see the graves of the great leaders of the nation of Israel, but more poignantly for them, they were going to visit the graves of their peers over the last many decades who have lost their lives in service to the country. I wasn't meeting anyone at Har Herzl, but as my family can attest, I felt a really strong draw to spend some time there, and I kept talking about it for several days. It finally became clear to me on my approach to the most famous spot, that large black grave of Binyamin Ze'ev Herzl, Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, the great visionary for the Jewish state. His grave is simple. It is large, it is square, and it has just one word on it: Herzl. It is surrounded by beautiful flowers. Can't imagine how much money and time they spend on those flowers. And it stands out against the large white backdrop of a plaza, empty on that morning, but with the capacity to hold hundreds for any of the state ceremonies that they host there. And I found myself lingering right there at Herzl's grave with no one else in sight and asking, "Oi, Herzl, what would you even think of Israel today?" That question had really been sitting with me heavily for some time, all 6 weeks that I spent in Israel, as it is the number one topic of conversation in Israel, and I'm sure you have had these conversations too. We've been talking about the Netanyahu government's judicial overhaul or reform, depending on how you're looking at it, and the huge protests across the country. You may recall that Theodor Herzl penned the pamphlet, The Jewish State, in 1896. Just a year later, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, consisting of some 200 delegates from all over Europe. Just a month after the conclusion of the Congress, Herzl reflected in his diary. Listen to this. "Were I were to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state." It's no wonder he didn't say that out loud. If I said that out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. But if not in 5 years, then certainly in 50, everyone will know it. It is stunning how accurate he was. Today, at the dawn of our new year, 5784, in the year that Israel has reached the milestone of 75 years young, I invite all of us to reflect on Herzl's vision, what this country has been able to achieve in its first 75 years, what's happening now, I'll talk about that too, and the essential follow-up question, what about the next 75? Theodor Herzl wasn't religious by any stretch of the imagination. He was a journalist in Vienna, and thus he was very aware of the plight of the Jews in Europe. We're not talking about the Shoah, the Holocaust, right? He lived and was active in the late 19th century. There was rampant anti-Semitism in his day, too. Famously, Herzl's watershed moment was an event known as the Dreyfus Affair, which many of you have heard of, in which Alfred Dreyfus, the Jewish French army captain, was falsely accused and found guilty of providing military secrets to the German government. And if that could happen in France, one of the more liberal countries at the time, Herzl didn't see much hope for the Jews. Here it is in Herzl's own words. "We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. it is not permitted us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens. Herzl's vision was simple: a sovereign state for the Jewish people in our historic homeland of Palestine. Achieving such a dream, that's the whole of the Zionist project. Herzl knew his vision could only come to fruition with the mass buy-in of the Jewish people, and not to mention the partnership, or at least the approval, of the leading nations of the world. Sitting here in 5784, the year 2023, it's easy to see why everyone would want to jump onto that bandwagon. We know what was possible. But at the time, it was such a tough sell. I mean, how many of us have up and moved to a place that didn't even yet exist? It's a big sell. Let me tell you a story that illustrates one of the key PR moves of the early Zionist movement. I heard it from Rabbi Ed Feinstein, longtime rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Los Angeles. He was talking about Max Nordau, the psychologist turned Zionist leader to whom Herzl was sent for a few sessions when Herzl began talking about the creation of a Jewish state, like he needed a therapist. During their third session of Herzl expressing his ideas, perhaps talking about some of the resistance he was encountering, Nordau reportedly stopped him mid-sentence and said, "Dr. Herzl, if you're crazy, then I'm crazy too." Herzl subsequently invited Nordau to deliver the keynote address at the Basel Zionist Congress, and Nordau did something extraordinary, something that spoke to the very fear so many Jews possessed. He redefined the Jewish term galut, exile, and suggested that it didn't only mean physical removal from the promised land, but could also be seen as a psychological category. Psychological galut, psychological exile, is that feeling that we just don't belong anywhere, that we're just not safe anywhere, that we walk through life in fear, that we're always tentative and afraid that we'll be judged for what we say. I imagine that many of us can relate to that, quite personally. And if the pull to build up a Jewish state wasn't enough to motivate the Jews of Europe, then the notion of psychological galut gave them the shove they needed to leave behind their current situation. A brief comparison of the world Jewish population tells the most inspiring story. In the year 1880, I'm going to give you some numbers. In 1880, 88% of the world's Jews spanned Europe and Russia. A mere 4% lived here in the United States. Not even 1% lived in Palestine, and about 8% were spread among other countries. Hard to even remember those days. A decade ago, in the year 2014, 10% of the world's Jews were in Europe and Russia, for many reasons. 39% live here in the United States, 9% among other countries, and here it is, a whopping 42% of the world's Jews live in Israel. We did it. That's it. Herzl died in the year 1904, much too young. We can only imagine how wildly elated he would have been to witness the establishment of the Jewish state, to see it built up over its first 75 years. Gives me the chills. Israel is exactly what he dreamed of. A sovereign state for the Jewish people, a place where no Jew is in galut, not physical exile, not psychological exile. Israel is a country like any other. It's not perfect. It is beautiful. It is its people, its land and its history, its culture, its transportation and its infrastructure, its workforce, its amazing innovation, its politics, its military, and of course, its conflicts. It is its unique Jewish character. It's a homeland for the Jewish people the world over. What Israel is not, it is not temporary. Israel is here to stay and has thus fulfilled and far surpassed its original Zionist dream. And each one of us, every Jewish person the world over, should feel tremendous, heart-bursting pride at this world-changing achievement. I know when I'm in Israel, and I really was so glad to spend 6 weeks there over the summer, there are elements of daily life that make me not just happy, but giddy. You probably already know that I am crazy about the Hebrew language. One of the greatest achievements of these last 75 years has been the reawakening of this ancient language and its transformation into a modern spoken language with new words being innovated each and every day. Did you know there is an entire organization devoted to coining new Hebrew words? It's called the Academia Lelashon Ha'ivrit. You can follow them on Facebook. It's really, really fun. Did you know there is a Hebrew word for using Facebook? Yaniv, le, fasbek. לא ידעת? מה פתאום? Okay, למדת משהו. לפסבק comes from the English. How about the word for pacemaker? Kotsev lev. They had to come up with a word for that. There's a word for vegan, tivoni. The ability for the Jewish people to communicate in our shared language, a language that finds its roots in our sacred scripture, that to me is really a dream come true. So many things I love about Israel are the ways it implements Jewish values and traditions on a grand scale. The national calendar, it is the Jewish calendar. Shabbat is Shabbat, and the Jewish holidays are the national holidays. You may know buses don't run in Jerusalem on Shabbat, and I learned this summer that while city buses don't run in Tel Aviv on Shabbat, they make a little exception, and they have private coach buses that run for free in Tel Aviv. So you don't have to use money, but you can still get around. That was kind of nice. Schools and businesses are open Sunday through Thursday. Friday is already the weekend, and everybody wishes each other Shabbat Shalom. Doesn't matter what they're doing on Friday night. Nobody needs to worry about the December dilemma. It's totally normal to appreciate the Christmas lights at the YMCA while also touring the city and viewing the beautiful Hanukkah lights on people's Chanukiot, all while munching a fresh sufganiyah. Not really a jelly donut. You can choose your own filling and your own topping, and they are delicious. Israel is a place where each Israeli is personally invested in the well-being of the state, and most have served the nation through military or national service. It is the site of so much Jewish history. Israelis learn it growing up by going on field trips with school and hiking the land. Even the most secular Israeli has a working knowledge of the Tanakh, our Hebrew Bible, because it's part of the public school system, and on and on and on. None of that is coincidental. Each element of Israeli society was part of the vision of the early Zionist leaders who dedicated themselves to realizing Jewish values in a sovereign nation. And it all sets the scene for what's to come. But first we have to talk about what's happening today, right now, because it's quite significant. Israel is experiencing a period of intense crisis. And the crisis, is not coming from another nation. It's not coming from a terrorist organization. The crisis is situated right inside of Israel, and it's about the very core of what Israel is and what it will be. Now, to make sure that we've got all the facts, here are a few bullet points to make sure that we all know what's going on. Number one, Israel's governmental system has not 3 branches, but just 2, the Knesset, or the Parliament, and the Supreme Court. For the last 75 years, the Supreme Court has had the legal power to review any law that the Knesset makes that it thinks might be unreasonable. They call this the unreasonableness doctrine. 2, for the last year, leading members of the governing coalition, Netanyahu's coalition, have been pushing for a major overhaul of the judicial system, claiming that the Supreme Court has sort of butted its head into areas that aren't part of its purview. Maybe. The proposed overhaul would severely reduce the Supreme Court's oversight capabilities and would permit the Knesset, not an impartial committee, to appoint new judges to the Supreme Court. 3, for the last 36 weeks, I think since last February or March, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been protesting this overhaul, peaking over the summer, you may have seen this, with a 4-day march, miles long, of people from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in that heat wave that I told you about, met by hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem ready to protest with them. There are protests each night in the major cities and every Saturday night all across the country. And 4, the first phase of the overhaul, the revocation of that reasonableness doctrine, was passed by all 64 members of the coalition on July 24th of this year. None of the liberal members of the Knesset were present. They had all walked out in protest prior to the vote. So those are the facts. In the background, you probably know, is also the fact that the Prime Minister is under investigation for corruption, and it's rather suspect of him to be changing laws that would work in his favor by empowering Knesset members who support him. Although those details are a little different, the political dynamic is quite familiar to us. It's just like what we're dealing with here at home in the States. Gone are the days of public discourse that's been replaced by the all too familiar dynamic of listening to the news that we agree with, speakers that we agree with what they're going to say, they say what we want to hear, and having a lot of trouble of listening to someone who has a different viewpoint from our own. And that makes me deeply sad for Israel, for Israelis. The question at the heart of this crisis is, what kind of country will Israel be? Will it remain the lone democracy, the lone liberal democracy in the Middle East, or will it become a country that bends to the will of its leader? Will it remain a state for all Jews, or just the kind of Jews who back said leader? Were Herzl here today, he would no doubt be deeply troubled by the threat to political stability in the Jewish state, by the rancor that pervades Israeli society. His dream was a homeland for the Jewish people, one people, and that oneness doesn't seem so unified these days. But if I were him, I'd be deeply proud of the citizens who are participating with passion in their democracy. What will happen in the near future? That's the question everybody wants an answer to. I asked a lot of Israelis and nobody had an answer. Things just feel stuck, and Israelis continue to dig in their heels. My guess, it's a guess that many people have, is that something in the governing coalition will crack and Israelis will head again to the polls. They've done that quite a number of times over the last number of years, and perhaps the election this time will yield a different result and perhaps will lead to some healing. One can hope. Here's the thing, though. The crisis will not last forever. It's feeling very big right now, but it simply cannot last forever. It will be a chapter in the history books, and the way out remains to be seen. And when this chapter closes, I hope and pray that Israel may be poised to dream its way into the next 75 years. Can you imagine at the end of the next 75 years, it will be 150 years old? The math is right? I'm not very good at math. Yeah, 150, thank you. That's hard to imagine, but it's gonna happen. After all, Zionism as an enterprise has always been aspirational, right? Herzl dreamed of the creation of the Jewish state. He famously said, Im tirtzu ein zo agadah. If you will it, it is no dream. Zionism, tzionut, is a natural outgrowth of the yearning to be restored to the promised land. Just see the Torah and the entire prayer book. Now the question is, what comes next? What are the next agadot, the next dreams to which Israel could aspire over its next 75 years? I have two of my own, but I'm going to invite you can think about it while I'm saying mine, or you can think about it later, to muster all of your creative imagination, your love for the state of Israel, and to articulate your own dreams. You could talk about that over lunch today. Here's the first dream. The Jewish state would embrace the fullness of the Jewish people. What would that look like? In the next 75 years, Israel could achieve confidence and trust in the breadth of the Jewish people. It could release its iron grip, its ultra-Orthodox iron grip on tradition. It could finally release that remaining little bit of galut, psychological exile, and lean into the unique and the varied ways Israelis do Jewish. Yeah, Israel has always been the home of the Jewish people. But I'd love to see that homeland offer equal recognition, financial support, rabbinic salaries to Jews of all streams and colors and backgrounds, Masorti or conservative, and progressive or reform communities would have the funding to support Israelis in their daily and weekly Jewish lives, not to mention through the highs and lows of their lives. All rabbis would be free to officiate at marriages, divorces, conversions, and no Israeli would need to fly to Cyprus for a non-Orthodox wedding, unless, of course, they wanted to. And each one of us would truly feel that we have a place in our people's home. It's a good dream, right? Here's my other one. Israel would have a strong and lasting peace with her neighbor state, Palestine. You knew I was going to say that. We're approaching this year the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Just 50 years ago, nobody could have envisioned a cessation of conflict with Israel's neighbors, let alone trade and travel agreements. Today, not only does peace reign between Israel and Egypt and Jordan, more recently with Bahrain, Morocco, and the United Arab Emirates, but even relations with Saudi Arabia have been on the table. Unheard of, and it's happening. Things are different with the Palestinians, but that doesn't mean that a peaceful end to this decades-long conflict isn't possible. In the spirit of these holy days, I submit that will only happen when both parties feel safe and secure, have stable and compassionate leadership, are willing to trust, to admit their mistakes, even going back to 1948 or perhaps even earlier, and to forge a new kind of relationship. It will take shedding those last little remnants of psychological galut to be brave enough to do what's needed to make peace a reality. We all know that the occupation is not sustainable forever. The occupation is not sustainable forever, and Israel knows that too. The occupation only comes to an end when Israel feels confident enough to be the bigger partner and to make room for the state of Palestine. Now that peace, that shalom, would be the crowning achievement of Israel's next 75 years. I hope I'm around to see it. Herzl would absolutely approve. Thinking back to that morning I spent on Har Herzl, I remember feeling a deep gratitude for the tremendous contributions made by each leader of the state and the sacrifices each soldier buried there had given to the country. Each leader built up the nation. Each soldier died defending it. What would Herzl think of the state that Israel has grown to be? Without a doubt, I think he would be proud of its passionate people and the place of belonging it offers for so many of the world's Jews. And obviously, he would also acknowledge that there's room for improvement. As we enter this new year, as Israel celebrates 75, I invite each one of us, to dream our own Zionist dream and then find a way to participate in it. In tirtzu, ein zo agada. If you will it, if we will it, it will be no dream. Shana Tova. We're going to head now to Musaf.